Church, say amen. If you got something to be thankful for, would you put your hands together? Thankful, thankful, thankful. We are looking forward to home for the holidays, and we thank you all for the tremendous labor you have invested. God bless you, and we are praying for a marvelous exhibit of your talent and the visitation of God's Spirit. Let me also acknowledge Dr. Yvonne Bowling, would you stand, and the members of our Christian Education Commission for producing this wonderful Advent booklet, which is available to you all. Thank you for your work. I want to thank our office staff, Brother Antoine as well. If you wrote a piece that is featured in our Advent booklet, would you stand? We want to acknowledge our authors. Thank you for your work. And one more brief point of personal privilege. Dana and I are overwhelmed by your signs of support and love. You've been so generous. We carted off a trunk full of your kindness, and we're so thankful. You will hear from us more formally, but I want to thank you for sharing the immense joy that is ours, and I want to ask my wife Dana to stand one more time, and I'm very thankful for you. Amen. See, when politicians are not very popular, they ask their wives to stand, those who are male politicians, and their numbers increase. And so we're thankful for what she brings to me. And then I want to acknowledge, again, the presence of my mother and father. It's a joy to be in worship with them on today. Thank God for them. And then I want to thank God for my auntie and my Uncle Alfred, who I want to ask my Uncle Alfred to stand. He is a retired minister, and from the very beginning has supported my ministry, poured into me, and has been a model of what it means to serve. And so I want to acknowledge Reverend Alfred Hazel, our little sister, and our brother Calvin and the children. We're so glad that you all are here. Let us pray. Lord, help me to preach. Amen. That's all I need. Isaiah, the 2nd chapter. I want to encourage us to slow down our Christmas vehicles because it is not Christmas yet. This is the season of preparation known as Advent. We are awaiting the coming of the reigning one, the one who will indeed transform the world into God's intention. And so as we are slowing down our Christmas vehicles, the passage assigned to us on this first Sunday of Advent, the first Sunday of the new Christian liturgical year, the prophetic text is the 2nd chapter of Isaiah, Isaiah 2, verses 1 through 5. Hear these words. The word that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations, somebody say all the nations shall stream to it. Many people shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways and that we may walk in his paths, that God may teach us God's ways and that God may teach us how to walk in God's path. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. The Lord shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares. They will beat their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn or study war no more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. This morning, I'd like to talk from this thought, Strange sounds from a strange mountain. Strange sounds from a strange mountain. Beloved, it is like the restaurant that all of your friends have talked up. There are long lines and yet no table reservations to rescue you on Resi or Open Table. The chef has been featured in both the Post and the Times. And finally, the restaurant gods smile upon you and you get a table. You unfold your napkin, you place it in your lap, and because you, like me, don't want lint on your threads, you request a black napkin. Your meal comes to your table, and the smell lures your taste buds into a dance. The presentation of the meal, Judge Newman, is a feast for your eyes. And Brother Don, you bring the first forkful to your mouth. You begin to chew. You pick up your black napkin and spit the contents into your napkin. And words inappropriate for the context of worship begin to arise in your spirit. And you refuse to pick up your fork again. It's like that. It's like the book release that you have been anticipating. Marketing hype abounds, and interviews of the author appear in all the right media outlets. They got a major PR team connecting them and pushing the book. The cover is on billboards and magazine covers and crawl across your screen when you are searching on Google. You download the book, or if you're like me, you order the book because you like the smell and feel and look of the real thing. You read the first few pages and flat characters bore you with their predictability. The author's language is about as clear as a bucket of mud. And you say to yourself, ain't no way in heaven or hell I'm reading 300 pages of this. It's like that. When I saw Mount Zion in 1997, the mountain that Isaiah prophesies concerning in this soaring text, it was like, Dr. Smith, I was reading that book in that restaurant. I had heard about Mount Zion all my life. There is not one black person in America who does not know 5 churches named Mount Zion. I was taught songs about Zion. The psalmist says, if we forget Zion, our tongue ought to cleave to the roof of our mouths. And then I saw Mount Zion, Brother Tom, for myself, not in a book, not in a biblical geography that lays out the topography of ancient Israel. I saw Mount Zion, Sion, with all 4 of my 23-year-old eyes. Now, Mount Everest towers 29,000 feet between Nepal and Tibet. Mount Kilimanjaro soars 19,000 feet over Tanzania. Mount Mitchell, located in North Carolina, is the highest peak in the Appalachian chain. It stands at 6,684 feet. But there is Mount Zion, located outside of the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. It stands at a whopping, towering 2,510 feet. As a matter of fact, the theologians correct us and say Mount Zion ain't no mountain at all. Mount Zion is a hill. According to tradition, according to Isaiah, the God who spat out the 7 seas, the God who rolled light in divine hands and flung sun, moon, and stars in their orbits, the God who, according to James Weldon Johnson, walked in hollowed out valleys, walked and pushed up mountains. These people believe that our God lived on a 2,500-foot hill. And in their poetic imagination, they believe that one day this little hill would become the highest mountain of all because God lives there. I came to tell us as a people and us as individuals, it does not matter if the hill in your neighborhood is small. If God lives there, it's a mountain. You couldn't tell the people who built Metropolitan A.M.E. Church their God lived on a mountain, or rather a hill. They knew their God lived in a mountain. You couldn't tell the people in Macon, Georgia, where I'm from, that God didn't live in a mountain. Though they thought that Macon was on hills, they were dwelling with a mountain God. Can't tell the people in Toulouse, Louisiana, where my wife is from, that their God doesn't live in a mountain, though it's just a little black hamlet a few miles away from the Mississippi River. You couldn't tell your grandmothers and your grandfathers, though they lived in Black Bottom on the other side of town across the tracks, that their God did not live in a mountain, though they had hill experiences in Georgia and Florida and Louisiana and Texas and Alabama and South Carolina, Nigeria and Ghana. Though they had hill experiences, they worshiped a God of the mountain. The Hebrew people there said that God lived, listen, on our hill. God lives on us's hill. Stop looking for God on other people's hills. Stop looking for God in other people's experiences. Stop looking for God in loftier places. If you look on your hill where God has redeemed you and forgiven you and opened doors for you and given opportunities to you, your hill has become a mountain. I found God on hills where old black men like my grandfather knelt down and said, we kneel as empty pitchers before a full fountain. I found God on hills where old sisters would kneel and pray, look, Lord, and please have mercy, sir. Found God on a hill where my Aunt Dot and Sweet Mama would have prayer meetings in their own house every day at noon. I found God listening to Mahalia Jackson with my mother and my aunt's mama as we rocked and listened, and Mahalia sung herself and my grandmama out of their wigs. Wherever God is, hills become mountains. And listen to this, these people were bold and brave and bad. Not only did they think their 2,500-foot hill was a mountain, but they believed their mountain was amazing enough that all the people of the world would find their way to it. They said that days will come when God's mountain will cause every nation to stream together to find out what it was that they knew. They said every people, every nation, every tongue would stream to God's mountain. Here is where our theology fails, and our denominationalism fails, and our sectarianism fails, and our chauvinism fails. It says every people will stream to this 2,500 hill where God lives. Muslims will stream, and Jews will stream, and Christians will stream, and atheists will stream, and agnostics will stream. Everybody will stream, not to be converted, but to be transformed. They will come to the mountain. They will climb the mountain. And the text says they will listen as God gives them instruction. Now, y'all, this made me about leap out of my homiletical skin. It says, not will a preacher teach them. Because right now, y'all getting what you get mitigated through Bill Lamar. That might be good, that might be bad. Not mitigated through a rabbi or a priest or a prophet, but all of God's people will stream to this 2,500-foot mountain, and God will convene a class. I'm talking this morning. about a class convened by God, no registration fee, no prerequisites, no need to send in transcripts from the colleges you attended in the past, but show up and God will teach. Y'all, I want a front row seat in that class when God steps to the whiteboard. Well, they have smart boards today. And God says, y'all sit down. Because my God talks like that. Y'all sit down. And let me teach you how to treat one another. Y'all sit down and let me teach you how to love one another. Y'all sit down. Let me teach you how to treat my earth, the soil, and all that I have given to you. Y'all sit down. And then America stands up and says, God, let us teach you something. And God tells them, America, sit down. You have nothing to teach. Then the Russians stand up and say, God, let us teach the world something. God says to the Russians, have many seats. You have nothing to teach. Then Great Britain and all of the empires, France, Italy, stand, Lord, let us teach you how to run an empire with efficiency. God says, sit down. I'm not interested in extracting anything. I'm interested in giving everything. You have nothing to teach. Oh, there's so many of us who are consumed with our own wisdom, with our own learning. But God says, your theology ain't got more truth than theirs. Your use of my name is not much more sophisticated than theirs. Let me show you what it is that I've been sending preachers and teachers and prophets to teach you. And in the class, before God has finished with the lecture, God begins to dismiss the class and sends them off of the 2,500 strange mountain back into the valleys from which they had ascended. And God listens out for what it is that they do next. Because God is not so much concerned that we have come to church or sat in the lecture hall. God is concerned with our ethical implications of what God has taught. What are you going to do now that you've heard the word? What are you going to do now that you've sat under my teaching? What are you going to do now that you've come to church Sunday after Sunday, Sunday school and Bible study? What will you do next? God is sitting on top of the 2,500-foot hill listening for what it is that we are saying and doing. And all of a sudden you see the sun shine brightly as the divine face begins to smile, because the text says we began to get it. We pulled out our swords. And we began beating them into plowshares, into instruments of abundance and instruments of love. God hears the clanging of instruments of war becoming instruments of peace. God hears us taking our pruning hooks that now used to be spears and feeding one another and blessing one another and lifting one another. God is teaching us from the strange mountain to move into the valley and make the strange sounds of turning conflict into peace, of turning war into peace, of turning internal turmoil into peace. Is anybody here today in your personal life, you need some peace? In our community, we need some peace. Geopolitically, we need some peace. You can pray for peace all you want, but until you start beating some spears and beating some swords, the peace will not come. And so beyond the shouts of the sermon and the clapping of the hands, what are we doing with the tools of war we've learned to love? How are we on the vanguard of God's transformational work of making this a world where all of God's children are provided for? How are we individually beating all of the confusion and the noise inside of us from a cacophony into a symphony that God can use to make the music of justice and peace available for all of God's children? From this strange little hill, God hears a strange sound. And I wish that God could be present in Washington, D.C. and convene a class for our political leaders. I wish that God would come to Washington, D.C. and convene a class for those of us who preach and teach here in the city. I wish that God would take us into the mall, you know, that huge park we have right downtown, and tell all of us to sit down and to remind us that the earth is the Lord's and not ours. To remind us that the cattle on 1,000 hills belong to God and not to us. To remind us that from the rising of the sun until the going down of the same, God is worthy. To remind us that we are those who worship God, that God does not worship us. To remind us that we are called to love our neighbor as ourselves. Is there anybody here today who's heard the strange sound of God from God's mountain calling you to a higher place of service, a higher place of worship, a higher place of ministry, a higher place of praise? From that strange mountain, God called Harriet, and Harriet set us free. From that strange mountain, God called Ida, and Ida rode us into freedom. From that strange mountain, God called Martin and Malcolm. From that strange mountain, God called the great W.E.B. Du Bois. From that strange mountain, God called Clay Evans and Jarena Lee. And I want you to know that from that strange mountain, God is calling everybody in Metropolitan Church today. Hush! Hush! Somebody's calling your name. Do you hear God saying, I want more from you? Do you hear God saying, I desire more from you? And I've determined after reading this text, I'm not going to call my mountain a hill, but I'm going to call my hill a mountain. That if God is there with me, this hill will be exalted. That small, insignificant Zion can become in our imaginations Mount Everest. That the smallest place can be lifted to the loftiest place. And as I take my seat and close my claim, I think there's some people here today who know that God can lift you from hill to mountain. Is anybody here today who remembers the hills where you're from? And can you look down from the mountain of where you are and say thank you? Is anybody here today that knows that God has lifted you from hills to mountains and you say thank you because you know it was nothing that you did, but it was the grace of God? Is anybody here today that came from meager circumstances and God lifted you up, from challenging backgrounds and God lifted you up, from nothing to something and God lifted you up, from nowhere to somewhere God lifted you up, from sickness to health God lifted you up, from depression to joy God lifted you up, from anger to happiness God lifted you up, from singleness to marriage, God lifted you up. From singleness to happiness by yourself, God lifted you up. From no money to provision, God lifted you up. From blindness to sight, God lifted you up. If there's somebody here today who's happy that God lifted you up, put your hands together and thank God that your hill has become a mountain, that your Zion has become Everest, that God has called you from the small to the large to be a blessing to somebody else. As we stand around the church, from this strange small hill called Zion, our hill, God dwells. God teaches. God moves us to do something, to beat our spears into pruning hooks, our swords into plowshares. We got to do something. We come to church, and I think we leave here thinking we have done what we're supposed to do. No, coming to church ain't what you're supposed to do. Coming to church leads you to the ethical response. And when you leave this place today, I want you to take more than your body out of the door with you. Have you noticed that the symbol of the African Methodist Episcopal Church is a cross atop an anvil? I want all of us today to leave here with an anvil so that you can go home and begin beating your swords and your spears. That we as a congregation and as individuals will learn to study war no more. The doors of the church are open today for someone who has learned to despise your hill. I want you to know that your hill is the hill where God dwells, and it is a mountain. And that if you will listen and climb that mountain, hear what God is instructing, others will follow God's light that shines through you. Someone who came from places where people called you insignificant, because Israel was an insignificant nation as far as population and power and wealth. God dwelled with them. But I'm convinced that God doesn't just dwell with Israel. God dwells with all people who seek the face of God. And so if you have been toying with your own feelings of inadequacy, know that God is calling you forward. We would love to be your church. I'd love to be your pastor. If you're looking for instruction more than the next conference, more than the next book, but to be taught by God, who is teaching the nations of the world what it means to be just, to be fair, to be lovely one to another, I invite you to come. God is calling you by name as the choir sings. Join us.